Let me begin by saying that, as usual, I'm coming from Gadigal country of the Eora Nation in Sydney, and I'd like to acknowledge that the Gadigal people who have cared for this land for countless generations never ceded this country to the British Crown or any of its successors. And I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. The quantum physicist David Bohm, who was the originator of the dialogue methodology that we use in the Anthropocene Transition Network, David Bohm described the practice of dialogue as learning to think together. Now, this doesn't mean groupthink, which can be defined as a phenomenon that occurs when the desire of a group for consensus overrides people's common sense impulses to present alternatives, critique a position, or express an unpopular opinion. In that case, the desire for group cohesion effectively drives out honest inquiry and robust problem solving. In Bohm's words, quote, "Suppose we were able to share meanings freely without a compulsive urge to impose our view or conform to those of others, and without distortion and self-deception. Would this not constitute a real revolution in our culture?" As we face the state change in the Earth system known as the Anthropocene, we find ourselves confronting fundamental challenges to our habitual personal and collective, that is, cultural, ways of thinking, doing, and being. So many of our taken for granted ways of making sense of the world and our place in it seem to be turning upside down. The ATN dialogue circles provide an opportunity to explore the increasingly disorienting and perplexing experience of rapid systemic change and profound uncertainty. So much of our approach to living is conditioned by a broad consensus about the future as a linear progression from the present. When those expectations are disrupted, how do we understand our place in the unfolding of life on planet Earth? What cognitive capabilities and cultural practices do we need to transition through the Anthropocene?
A lot of things, but Mari brought up a direct personal experience with somebody who is from QAnon. But anyway, talking about cognitive issues and dissonance, that was a sort of amazing experience. I found that pretty interesting to contemplate. Anyway.
Ari, that sounds like an invitation for you to share that experience with everyone, if you're willing.
It was just that, in our group just now, we were talking about the need for kind of cultural awareness and understanding of Indigenous knowledge and that sort of thing. But suddenly, out of the blue, I felt compelled to share this experience today because I've just travelled to a meeting of XR people to get on with some banner making and things. So I was with a young woman who was telling me that she doesn't talk to her sister because her sister is a member of QAnon and it's reached the stage where they just can't talk to each other. And she's one of four, there are 4 children, and of the 4 children in that family, the one who is the member of QAnon is the only one who sort of left school early and didn't get any kind of tertiary education, whereas all the others are much more highly educated. Now, I should also say that in addition to that, she's also very, very focused on wellness and her own appearance and all that sort of thing as well. So there are couple of things going on in her life, but I picked on the thing that it made me, because we were talking about the way that she brings up this constant QAnon sort of meme that do your own research, but her concept of research is to something that she's seen on, on Facebook, not something that has been published in a reputable journal and things. So she actually believes now even that COVID is a hoax. So I did think that perhaps, while not sort of sufficient, a certain educational level was necessary. In addition to, so, I mean, I'm not talking that people all have to go to university, by the way. I just mean that we need to ensure that our children are equipped with the skills to know how to find out whether something, get some sense of whether something is valid information or not, and what that means. I don't know.
Yes, it's a very important question, I think, because in a period when so many of the certainties are disintegrating, for a lot of people, that's well, I think probably for all of us, to some degree, that's alarming, and it kind of stands to reason that some people will grab at things that appear to give to them a credible account of what's going on. How could all this be happening unless it was some sort of coordinated conspiracy? To me, it really points to the need in our education system at a pre-tertiary level to place much greater emphasis on critical thinking skills. Whereas in fact, we're going in the opposite direction with standardized national testing and a big emphasis on STEM and a discouragement of people to do areas where critical thinking is part of the practice. Karen.
Yes, and picking up on that, it's this idea that in today's world, our research for a lot of people is done on the internet. So the searches and the way people get information feeds are driven by these algorithms that create the extreme version of groupthink that you started with, Kenneth, and so that sense that you only get to see what reinforces those views. And when I heard Mari's story, I thought of something that I've only just read by Sarah Wilson in The Guardian, that's aligning, that's talking about how the wellness industry has been totally sort of consumed with, or sort of infiltrated, if you like, by QAnon. And there's so many people who have who come from a whole range of, educations and backgrounds and so on, and now, who are part of the wellness industry. And yet these QAnon conspiracy theories and all that are really rife in this area. And Sarah talks with a lot of compassion about why and how this has come about. And I think this feeds into what sort of cultural capabilities and cognitive capabilities we need, because what she's seeing is the wellness industry has become a cherry picking of privileged ideas about me being well, this individualism, and just looking after ourselves in this wellness way, and not bringing with it the responsibilities that come, the social and cultural responsibilities that come from, you know, like even yoga and so on. There's a lot of social cultural responsibility about us. It's not about me.
We spoke a bit about this notion of, well, the individualism as opposed to the greater organism. Kylie was speaking about, you know, everyone being, you know, cells of the same body essentially, and we talked a little about what we had picked up from First Nations thinkers and cultural practice, that actually this autonomy can exist and hierarchy at the same time, but with this tie to the greater being, this responsibility to others and life and just the earth generally. And Margaret really gave some beautiful examples of that, I felt, in terms of how we take from the land for short-term gain, I think, not seeing those connections. And I just wanted to add to, Kylie and I have both been reading Sand Talk by Tyson Yunker Porter. So, you know, thinking about ways of thinking and context, how we can get very locked in our ways, how if we slow down to actually become better in tune with context, we can drop some of our habits. And I just wanted to go back to Karen's point talking about the algorithms. I just wanted to say that someone, I can't remember who it was, but they shared an incredible article and video in the last session about Indigenous algorithm resetting, but that was quite incredible. So I'd love for that to be brought up again somewhere.
Okay. Thanks, Floria. As you pointed out, most Indigenous cultures have a very strong notion that the health of a community is a function of the health of the environment, the health of country, and you need a healthy country to have a healthy people and a healthy community. And it's interesting, I think, that over the last few years, this whole movement has arisen in mainstream medicine around the notion of planetary health. It's pointless to talk about human health unless you talk about planetary health for the same reason. An unhealthy planet will create unhealthy people, and not just people, but more than human animals as well. Can we just come back to this conspiracy thing, because it's an interesting topic that I think we really need to grapple with, because when we talk about algorithms influencing the way we perceive the world through our use of the Google search engine, through our participation in Facebook and Twitter, and all these things that are mediated by algorithms, in a sense, there is a kind of conspiracy there. In other words, we're being manipulated by unseen forces that we're not necessarily aware of. Where's the line between understanding those kind of systemic unseen forces, but they're not unconscious forces, and the kind of fantastic conspiracies that related to the literati and the QAnon and all those sorts of things? Margaret?
I guess if you want a bit of the technological and the economic drivers behind it, there's a YouTube video that's free, a documentary called Social Dilemma, it's called. So they talk about this, and they talk about the profit motive and how a lot of social media platforms, you are the product. They're actually quite adept at manipulating you psychologically to keep you hooked. And also they can, through paid advertising or targeted information, quite manipulate what you can and can't see based on your demographic and other things. I mean, that's one aspect of abuse by maybe a multinational that's profit driven without the regulations in place. you don't necessarily have media ethics on those sort of platforms or any sort of screening of factual information. I don't know, I talked to a young girl earlier this week and I was asking her how she got her news, and she literally, the only way she gets her news is via Instagram because it's better than Facebook, and Facebook because it's what people share. So if you don't have a diverse source of information, and also if it's information that's not necessarily reputable or trustworthy, I think you get what you subscribe to. Yeah, I don't know. I think that there's also, you've got the Royal Commission going in that Kevin Rudd's driving. I think he had 500,000 signatures or whatever it is into the Murdoch press. Potentially there's politics at play and aligned with oil and gas interests. I mean, I think it's crazy, but, fracking. But, it's a personal opinion. That's one, but I do read widely. So I kind of think that I'm more informed in my opinion but that's not necessarily the common opinion. And it's the common opinion that drives support of policy, and it's the common opinion that drives election of leaders. So Hitler was elected, hell, And the same forces that I think went on there probably are going on now, except you've got it happening much faster, more accessible, and with less scrutiny of the message that's being spread, and globally. So
following on from what you said, Margaret, was you pointed out the algorithms are basically designed to maximize profit, to get people to look at the things that are going to generate income for those companies. Really what's driving this is an underlying rationale of a particular kind of a neoliberal market economy. And, we accept so much of that as being just normal. So we accept the fact that we live in a society where multi-billions of dollars are spent on manipulating opinion to get people to buy things. There's a very interesting documentary called The Century of the Self, and it's about the emergence of the public relation as a respectable professional practice that's accepted across the political spectrum. It's worth having a look at. Sam?
I wanted to bring this up when we're talking about education and the perhaps inoculating effect of education. I think one needs to be careful about that, because the education system is not there to educate people in a naive way. It's there to make them good citizens, etc. There's a lot of evidence about that. But there's one particular, what I found personally a very strong example of an argument. It's a feminist economist. I think her surname is Nelson. She wrote about her discipline. She analysed the discipline of economy historically and what was happening in the main societies when different things in the economic discipline. And this is way before neoliberalism, by the way. I found that a very powerful antidote to the idea that, in particular, university education should be seen as somehow liberating. It certainly can be. This was talking about the discipline of economics, and everyone has been bagging this for a long time. This article is a terrific analysis of that and breaks it right down. And I think that can be done with many disciplines, actually. And the whole idea of discipline, most of us in the West, say the groups that come together like us today, tertiary educated, we've been successful at negotiating those disciplines, in the way they're presented to us, and it leaves a mark.
I'd flag here as necessary reading Ivan Illich's book, Deschooling Society. It seems to me that was written in the 60s. It's a very powerful critique of that process. And along a similar vein, I don't know that you can find this anymore, but there was a very seminal journal article that had a lot of influence on my thinking in years by, written by Bud Hall, who was an adult educator in Canada, and it was called Breaking the Academic Monopoly. Basically, he was arguing that we've created this approach to education where we see a particular way of knowing as being the only valid way, and that people who don't know through that particular practice shouldn't be taken seriously. And as an adult educator, he found this a big challenge to deal with.
I just posted in the chat, but I think it's only to you, Kenneth.
Yeah.
2 articles. One was about QAnon and relating that to game design.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a review of QAnon by a game designer, and saying, you know, that the processes that they use, the algorithms, the technique of taking people down the rabbit hole, as they say, is by, you know, instilling in people that the control of, you go and find that information, because once people find the information themselves, then, you know, they become, you know, it empowers them.
Mm.
And so, you know, that's part of this sort of game playing theory applied to QAnon, and it is fascinating that it has come to that. I found an article today that was talking about going beyond systems thinking, but a quote that seems appropriate to this was, in situations of stress, insecurity, or any other manifestation of fear, we're conditioned to react more instinctually and to operate from our reptilian brain to fulfill more rudimentary needs linked to survival. And so I sort of relate that to, you know, the umbrella of fear that, you know, media helps to hold up over our heads. You know, like there is the fear of climate change, whether people understand that or not. You know, that I think we sense that in our bodies. You know, where we have that fear fed through all sorts of other racism and otherism, all of these things. And so, you know, I wonder if that helps to explain, you know, part of this polarization, that there are some people, they just can't help. They just can't help but go down these paths that seem to reinforce security, for, you know, an idea of what security is, even though it from my thinking, it would be that it's the opposite of security, and it's the opposite of having control. It's like giving over control to go down these paths that we're seeing sort of play out in America, particularly at the moment. And then I also I'll post these into the Transitions Hub, but another article called Metaphors We Live By. And I think it probably aligns with Nora's sort of thinking. And it sort of goes through a range of, for example, it says argument is war. And there's a number of phrases here. Your claims are indefensible. He attacked every weak point in my argument. His criticisms were right on target. So it's you know, how we use this sort of language to define challenges, or and I think our media is very good at doing that to reinforce a position and to build that fear. And then, because the antithesis to that fear aspect is feeling a feeling of contentment, I think. And this is when, you know, we're better able to learn and collaborate and create. And so, yeah, anyway, that's so part of what Chris and I discussed was, I think, looping around to look at what is it that connects us, thinking about Indigenous culture as like returning to source, perhaps, and then reviewing what it is that we've done, our technologies, through that perspective. And then we talked about Joanna Macy's work that reconnects, which is sort of talking about a spiral, which I think we both thought was had potential to look at a lot of these challenges through that spiral. First, which is gratitude, honouring our pain, sensing with new eyes, and then going forth. I just find that an interesting spirally framework. to reflect on.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm just soaking all this up. I've got things going around in my head, and I could say a lot or I could say nothing. So I think I'm going to stay with saying nothing at the moment.
Right,
it's probably
okay.
safer for you all.
Okay, let it cook. We'll be waiting for the outcome. Okay, Floria.
I guess the question is centered around this idea of, you spoke, Jane, about reconnecting, and we've been talking about health and then also the health industry, and I'd like to pick up on reconnecting and individualism within that, and how you've got things like the algorithms feeding into that, individualism. So, being able to focus on one's individual health is, in my opinion, a way that we can regain some sort of, at least in a superficial sense, perhaps, like some sense of feeling of control. And so it's interesting because I'm just interested in hearing people's thoughts on how you've got this connectivity that's trying to happen there, but it's also, there's something else happening there within a sort of a neoliberal framework where people are no longer listening to each other, where there actually isn't connectivity. So it's looking for connectivity, but it's avoiding connectivity at the same time. So I wonder of people's thoughts on that.
I will say something.
Okay.
In relation to that. So just sitting here and see if I can get it all out. But my mum's in hospital at the moment, and she has this weird thing that nobody has a name for. That happens about once a year to her, and she ends up in hospital with it. And every time there's this flurry of doctors asking the same questions and kind of seeing her as a little old lady who doesn't know a whole lot, but actually in the end she's really the expert on this. And I'm thinking, okay, that's quite an individualistic way of thinking about it, isn't it? That here I am, someone who believes in lots of connections and complex systems, and here's my mum who I support kind of on her own in the system. And I'm thinking, I wonder if that's how a lot of the people that we were talking about who have these experiences with our health system, because I must admit, I often go to doctors and I feel like they're tits on a bull sometimes. I haven't found them terribly helpful. They're part of the puzzle. But if I were someone with a slightly less, slightly less charitable mindset, I might think, rather than they're part of the puzzle, I think they're completely useless. I'm never going to a doctor again. The what's the word? The kind of mainstream health thing doesn't work, and therefore I'm looking for truths and other things. That leads me into those spaces where a lot of those QAnon people are. And it's a very understandable mindset, actually, from where I'm standing at the moment. And it is about control, I think. But in trying to control too much, you kind of end up down this rabbit hole where you discard a whole lot of pieces of the puzzle because it's part of the mainstream, or it looks like part of the mainstream, or it's something that you don't connect with. Anyway, there you go. There's something.
Okay, thank you. Margaret.
I don't say much more other than to say it kind of reminds me of the conversations that were happening around the time you had school bombings or whatever it was, terrorist things, where it's kind of people felt either disconnected from the communities that they're in, or somehow ostracized, or somehow not feeling like they're part of a wider system that benefited them, or maybe they were disenfranchised in some way, and you just had people who were almost targeting them and grooming them. And I kind of feel like that story reminds me of that scenario, and I just wonder whether similar processes are going on.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's interesting that in that book of Ivan Illich's, Deschooling Society, it's not just about the education system, it's about a bigger process of professionalization. That part of his argument is that in the modern world, we've kind of professionalized certain areas of knowledge that previously had been more collectively practiced. You know, there may have been somebody who was a skilled healer in the village, but in some ways, a lot of their knowledge was shared, or the premises of their knowledge. Now, some of it we would say in the scientific sense was not, fully verifiable. But the point is that as areas of practice become professionalized, the professionals take control of that knowledge and how it's formed, and remove the possibility of other people accessing it except through a professional. And in a sense, the professionalization process requires you to surrender your own agency to the professional. And we see it very clearly in medicine. So many people, I'm sure we all know people like this, who, for whatever their doctor says, is kind of a sacred text almost. You know, the doctor said so-and-so, and it can't be questioned. Or the obverse of that is that people say, oh, I went to the doctor, but they couldn't give me a clear answer. Well, the problem is that the issue is a complex one for which there isn't a clear answer, but they expect that the doctor, being the professional, needs, and the expert should be able to say, here's the problem, here's the solution. So it's interesting the way these kind of social, cultural forms emerge and how they kind of alienate or exclude many people. And of course, this is what is argued has happened in the United States, that there's a whole strata of the population who feel they've been excluded from public life by the kind of political professionals. And they call them an elite, but it's a bit of a nonsense when, you know, you've got a multi-billionaire who's considered to be one of the people. But nevertheless, there's this notion that somehow or other there's a kind of professional elite who have taken away agency from the lives of large numbers of people who feel powerless. And they probably are.
Mary, you were talking about education, and as were you, Kenneth. And I had a thought in there relating to education needing to be teaching people how to learn rather than what to learn. And there are many ways, you know, in which that can happen, many, you know, cultures on how we learn. So this can open up in a huge way. I think we can become very disconnected when some people have learnt a lot of things and we don't feel the agency to actually pursue knowledge. It's just like, well, I wasn't given that knowledge, so I'm out of the picture. If you've been taught how to, you know, seek knowledge, if you've been given various tools for that, you're empowered. You can go, well, I don't have a clue now, but you know, I might be able to follow this up. So I think, Mary, that touches on what you brought up a lot earlier. Yeah, I felt strongly this class divide, having come from a working class background and being a child immigrant where I actually had to learn the language. So I really felt like I was on a back foot and felt a lot of anger coming into student household full of, once a long while ago, full of middle class, kids who, had English as their immediate first language and all that. Being taught how to follow up. I think if a teacher can do that, give you some tools around, how to actually access information, you can follow up on your own. You've got, you're empowered and you're connected.
Mary.
Thank you. I'm sort of really grateful for the way that this conversation has been going, because when I brought up what I did bring up, it was I was tossing up two different ways, of thinking about these issues, because the other side of it was that the person who I was talking about was also very involved in wellness. And this is how she got into this sort of thing anyway. But then somebody else mentioned, the whole wellness thing is sometimes a kind of feeling of disempowerment. And, I've been very aware of the extent to which the so-called elite, the Hillary Clinton sort of referring to people as deplorables, that kind of class thing that's going on with education. And I was very wary of the fact that if I bring up education, it would kind of, seem as if I was going in that direction. But it's kind of like I really feel as if when I was faced with this thing that went on after the discussion that went on in the car today coming home, it was like I wanted to know what's going on here. And I really feel as though all these different inputs that have been coming from all of you has sort of started to really open a lot of doors about it. And yeah, so I just want to express my appreciation for that, because I think unless we understand more clearly what's driving people, and it's to do with not only sort of what people think, obviously, but how they feel and how they understand their connectedness to other people and an ability to see other perspectives and things, then, it's I'm tired. I don't know where that sentence was going to end, but basically it seems that there are a whole lot of complex things going on with how we respond.
Well, there's Kevin.
There's Kevin again. To things, and everybody has a I think it's really important. I think I wanted to make it really clear that when I talked about sort of people need to have a level of education where they feel they can challenge things, but I certainly didn't mean education in the sense of being able to tick the boxes. I've got this qualification or that qualification. It was more, how do people make sense of the world, because it's a complex world, and we need to help people to do that. And I think what we're doing now by sort of talking in dialogue about it is one of the ways.
Well, thank Kevin for his contribution. That was a salient contribution. Margaret.
I guess back to the education thing. I don't know, I come from two worlds. One where my mother's side of the family hardly makes it to grade 6, and my father's side of the family, probably the most educated one in their generation now. But I was lucky enough that he taught himself how to run a business and put us through really good schools. So I got to see the elite side of Australian education as well. And I think to a degree, I look at like engineering certification, because I studied engineering, and there is a degree of you trust, or that it's a reflection of quality because you've gone through a whole process, and therefore what the advice should be trustworthy. But if you're collectively wrong, and you're challenging people's egos, there's a degree of that. And also, I don't know, I've looked at coronavirus and things like doctors coming up with methods where it's like, by the way, you've been diagnosing people and people at the margins are dying because you're diagnosing them wrong. And I came up with a new way. So I think there's a degree of a scientific process where you can challenge it, and provided you can defend what you're saying and demonstrate it through results, there can be continuous improvement. But I do think there's a degree of elitism. And I've experienced that even with my jobs where it's like, oh, they went to this university, so we'll hire from this university, and you pay a ridiculous amount to go there, and I think you're buying your networks as well as your piece of paper that's a reflection apparently of quality, also of elite private schools, because that's the only people who can afford to go there. But so I think there's a degree of like excluding people and breeding a degree of elitism in a governance, and anyone who's in a profession. I mean, you need money to sometimes go to some of the best schools to get the OP in Queensland, to get into the universities, because it's a rationing system that allows only. And it's a rationing system, I think, with schools that ration for highly competitive positions in a school, in a university system. So medicine, high status position, you tend to need to be pretty smart. You're dealing with people's lives and there's a risk involved. Then maybe engineering, then maybe something else. But thereafter, it's not a reflection necessarily of your effort or how smart you are or how much you can contribute to society. It's a reflection of a system that rations towards a degree of scarcity, really, and what people value in society, perhaps, or at least what people who have money value. So, and I also look at, like, I've been researching a lot about racism and, the history of women empowerment because of development economics. I'm trying to understand what's happened over history and what's driven social change. But I think manifestations like QAnon are not, and they're a reflection of the system. Then they're an event that is a reflection of the system, and the system is structured in a way that those things can happen. And maybe it is a reflection of people. I do think it's a reflection of people feeling disempowered and trying to claim back some sort of either economic power or social power or a society where they're respected and valued for their contributions in some way. But
Thank you. Jane.
Yeah, I'm thinking about modern democracy. I'm thinking about I saw John Ralston Saul, who's a Canadian author. He once spoke about Canadian democracy when it began in the late 1800s. It was sort of based on the idea of universal education and universal health principles, and I just find it interesting in that sort of cyclical thing that, now you look at modern democracies and, we're in a health crisis, and, we have governments arguing about, our universal healthcare systems and our education systems, that, these ideals that we had when we started, modern democracy have been eroded, and possibly, by the neoliberal conservative capitalist movement. There's a parallel there, trying to drag back those gains. So I feel that we can go back to, this basic education, which, as somebody mentioned, was, about how to learn, going back to first principles. I was teaching at Deakin University this year, and I had to go back to first principles to, do the online thing. And also I just suddenly got stuck in this class, and I had never taught it before. But what it was for me, I was teaching sustainability, and I know that all the systems are going to change. The way that the students are going to be assessing buildings, the energy they use, how they're going to be putting them together will be totally different. But it's a matter of going back to first principles. What are the things, from which everything is built, and what is this all based on? And then I go back to looking at biological systems, the basis, those as a basis for learning as well. I see citizen science being, this beautiful manifestation that's, been made possible by, the connections that we have, where everyone can become a scientist and contribute. And I think that is a beautiful thing. They're the sort of things that I'm seeking in this time.
Margaret.
To add to that is, I saw a quote today which said something like, "Stop telling children to code because the AI will take their jobs faster than they can learn," or something like that. And you're better off teaching them ethics so they can be whatever they want to be and, bring it together. But I think your point is good. Maybe principles or ethics or some sort of philosophy to a better world or something that people can unify and work towards.
I've long had the view that we need fewer teachers and more learning facilitators, or people who can help people to learn for themselves. And particularly as in this age of prevailing view that learning can be best done if it's very focused on specific learning outcomes. And it's a very mechanical way. Some educators have called it Taylorism applied to education. Of course, Taylorism is the underlying philosophy of mass production. But the experience I wanted to tell you about was some years ago when I was working in staff development in the TAFE system. I was running an action learning project for a whole lot of people in the Western Division of New South Wales, west of the Great Divide, who were the facilitators of self-managed work teams that they were introducing in that TAFE Institute. And they were so we were using an action learning methodology. And then they were using action learning to bring their colleagues in their colleges into this process. And so the action learning involved every fortnight, these 8 or 10 people from all over Western New South Wales would come together in Orange or Bathurst, and they would, and I'd facilitate an action learning roundtable or what was called an action learning set. For them, in which they'd report on and reflect on what they were learning in the process of introducing this kind of team thing in their colleges. And it was a very interesting and intense experience, because people not only talked about and were encouraged to talk about not only what they were doing in a kind of practical way with their groups, but also their own process, what they were learning and the challenges they were facing and how they were dealing with those challenges. So that was the process that was going on. So these fortnightly meetings, that would be half a day long, they were very intense. And the people, although they're from all different places, built a very strong sense of collegiality amongst them, a strong sense of community. And it emphasized how important relationship is to learning. And at the end of the project, there was this session where a number of the senior executive of the Institute met with the people who'd been involved in the program, which was a kind of pilot, to hear what their experiences had been. And they told these stories of what they'd been doing and what they'd got out of their learning group when they came together every fortnight and whatever. And at the end of it, the director of the Institute, who was a very, hard-bitten old TAFE veteran with a background in horticulture, he said something which was so moving and revealing. He said, "The thing that I'm most impressed about with this project is the strong sense of community that has obviously developed amongst those of you involved." He said, "I have never known this in my professional life. And he said, and I yearn for it. And, you know, everyone felt the shivers run up their spine. And he was really pointing to how important relational processes are to learning. Floria.
Kenneth, I'm really glad that you ended on that relational processes, because that's what I wanted to pick up on. Sorry, I'm gutsing time, but just thinking about that in terms of some of the learning that I see happening now through my children, and also my partner who is a teacher and helps other teachers as a learning specialist. So, you know, I guess they sort of look at how they can work with curriculum and so on. And one of the things that I've had a lot of joy in seeing is this growth in what is called individual inquiry learning, and where we're no longer seeing, you know, a subject being taught here and a subject being taught there, but a child has an interest, they're able to follow that interest within that, they have their individual inquiry, and they explore with various subject matters drawn into their inquiry. So when I say subject matters, I mean ways of learning, I guess. So you might be able to look at something from a mathematical or an arts or a humanities perspective. My daughter was looking at marine life. So, you know, there's all of these ways of learning that can come together in the one inquiry. She then became a 7-year-old marine specialist that people could go to for advice, and she could go to others for to learn of certain topics. But each child had developed their ability to actually inquire in a number of ways, get a sense of different ways that we can learn about the one subject matter. And I wanted to relate this back also to some of what I've read recently in Sand Talk by Tyson, and this context specific ways of learning and how things are relational. Also, Kenneth, you were talking about having sort of an intention or something. I can't remember exactly what it was, but there's a danger in that too. You know, in setting that inquiry, I find often we miss a larger context. And an example for me was given this section which spoke about a sandbank, the sand slipping away, and how to deal with that. These kids had been given the task to figure it out, you know, how you stop the sand just moving away with the tides. And this followed on from some part of discussion around a town and how people have tried historically again and again to find an answer for a particular problem, and it becomes a short-term answer, and then the next problem. So, you know, this just slowing right down, not having to fix everything in an instant. I think Tyson was also talking about that in the last discussion, and just going, no, let's really stand back, as this kid did in that part of the book that he was describing. Just stand back instead of trying to find a solution, straight up, look at the whole context, look at the broader context, and go from sort of an open inquiry kind of approach.
There was a very interesting example just recently of algorithms and learning. I don't know if any of you picked up on this, of what happened in Britain a few weeks ago. Because of COVID, the public exams couldn't go ahead because people couldn't come together. So the IT boffins in the education department designed a algorithm that could be used to evaluate students instead of an exam. And the algorithm included many factors, including their previous school scores in evaluation. And I'm not sure whether it included any actual live teacher input, but it also included what sounds good, contextual information, like where they lived, the income level of their household, where they had been to school previously.
Mm.
And surprise, surprise, it passed mostly students who came from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, because people that lived in certain areas or whose parents worked in certain industries or whose household were deemed to be statistically and statistically validly likely not to succeed in higher education.
Mm.
And there was a huge outcry in Britain. I mean, it was very good in a sense. It backfired in a big way. there was a huge outcry about the unfairness of this, and it had to be withdrawn. And it's now stimulated a discussion in Britain about alternatives to examination by ordeal, which is the way most public examinations are conducted, which favour children who have been well socialised into a particular way of learning and performing in tests, discriminates against children who have difficulty with that way of learning. So something good could come out of this. It was an interesting debate that it stimulated. Margaret.
Just the thought that there is historical inequality, and I feel like we're in a world where inequality is actually increasing, not decreasing. But I do, I don't know, like with women, I come from PNG, so I've been looking at the elections and how there's no female MPs currently, and the men say no, they should run and fight like everyone else, and then you realize that it's actually not a fair system. They're using public money, sorry, PNG, but they're using public money to rig by votes, and women have to get permission from their partners to vote, and there's all sorts of issues where you end up in a situation where, despite international advice where you should have certain quota systems for either political parties or positions in parliament, that's not happening to overcome that systematic injustice. So you don't get them at the table, they're not represented in decision making, they're being marginalized even, and their lives are making it worse. So if you're not getting different perspectives at the discussion, let alone decision making table, you're only going to end up with reinforcing the same ideas. So my thought is there that maybe there's a lot of outcry with that educational outcome because it's a manifestation of an unfair system, and that you need to invest resources in overcoming that inequality or injustice in some way in order for it to be a better outcome now, and because you can have intergenerational effects that perpetuate and reinforce that inequality. So we need to be looking at it as who have we got on the table, and if they're not at the table, why?
Everyone. Yeah, so we'll start with Chris.
I just wondered if anybody here has ever come across Peter Turchin. He is someone I heard on the radio in about 2009-ish. And he is an ecological modeler, and he woke up one morning and thought, I wonder if I could do this with social systems. And so then he started to try and model social systems. And he was fascinating. He talked about tracking well-being and inequality. And so it's the inequality that's echoing for me here. So the higher your inequality, the lower your well-being is in a society. And he's got some quite clear measures of those things. And he's measured them both in ancient societies and in modern ones. And he says human systems cycle. So they do this kind of, zigzagging thing because they're inversely proportional to each other. So as you move, and we're in a period at the moment that's very similar to what was going on before World War II, which is why, which is a bit creepy actually. And there's lots of similarities to that time. But one of the things that he said, this is not good news, but one of the things that he talks about is that when in this point of high inequality and low well-being in all the societies that he's looked at, it gets solved by war. And he's not seen it get solved any other way, which I kind of think, oh shit, and then I read Sand Talk like everybody else, and one of the things that came out of that for me is that we've lost our capacity to pass down our knowledge. Because if my grandparents had told me a few things of the right variety, I suspect we wouldn't have to be here, because that was my lifetime over which this happened. So I think, oh, that's interesting, isn't it? But it also makes me think this is not just about now. This is something kind of deeper about the human psyche and the kinds of societies we live in. And I do wonder if maybe what war does, particularly because he was tracking inequality, but is, war, in times of war, there's a massive shift in how the economy works. Massive shift twice. If you look at World War II, huge shift. So big depression, suddenly the government spends because they need to produce weapons and they need to pay soldiers and and so a whole lot of money floods into the economy. They did a whole lot of things to manage the inflation around that. You get to the end of the war and there's another massive shift, huge. The whole economy has to be redirected all over again. So I did wonder if COVID might have an effect, and I don't think it's going to have a big enough one. But I wondered if it didn't have to be war, it just had to be this excuse for a government to take over an economy and direct it into this kind of more equal thing. Anyway, that's just a question I have and some observations given what we've been talking about tonight.
Yeah.
Of course, one of the dangers in that pattern, which I think is clearly observable in history, is that sometimes the things that are introduced in a time of emergency don't go away again. So the example is, in fact, the American economy. It was militarized overnight, or in a very short period of time in the United States, to produce all these Liberator bombers and tanks and etc. on a massive scale, and it never stopped. The military-industrial complex was created in the Second World War, and it became a pillar of the American economy ever since. So, we got to be careful what we wish for.
Yeah, that's right. But how do we learn from it, I suppose?
Yes, absolutely. Jane.
Well, I'm thinking, like the other part of that is just how short-term our thinking actually is. So these cycles, so is what we're going through now, it's, thinking about coming out of World War II or World War I and the military-industrial complex rising up alongside, a capitalism that's promoted by, ever-increasing cleverness in advertising, which has been derived from propaganda techniques honed through war. We're sort of still in the tail end of that. It's not a disconnect from that. We're still actually, on that trail. So this is where I think about the, continuing to cycle back, and part of what we were taught at the end of that time, the beginning of this time, is that concept of progress, that linearity of this is all progress, which helped us to forget or disregard the lessons of our grandparents and our great grandparents who lived in with using very little energy in their homes, who still had a comfortable life, raised way too many children, probably. But then I was thinking about, and I just so happened to have the adaptive cycle, which was also based on an ecological metaphor for succession. So it's, the idea of, exploitation of resources and then conserving them. That's part of what, the political complex is do. It's all about conserving. Oh no, we have to keep things the same, but already, we've our ecological systems have dropped down into this space. So, it's about actually how do we reorganize and regenerate. And I mean, you've got this system here, which looks very simple, but actually it's a nested hierarchy of systems like this. This is the greater movement, but there are a whole lot of little movements spinning off, at various stages of this. And again, this is where I take heart and hope from, groups like this getting together and talking through ideas about, people getting together and pulling out weeds along the creek, about people, learning new ways of learning. All of these things, they're this like little cycles of this greater cycle of reorganization. And, definitely we're in a stage of release where we can't be conserving this anymore. But of course, the prevailing paradigm wants you, its aim is to conserve. And yeah, I can start thinking about this in terms of a forest and disturbance in a forest. You probably all can to some extent, because that's where this model comes from. But yeah, I enjoyed this. This model gives me reassurance as well. It's these cycles that we need to keep revisiting.
Yes, and of course that appears to be an underlying cycle for all natural systems. For those who want to pursue that, it's Buzz Holling or Hollings, and he called it panarchy. His approach was panarchy, and one of the most interesting things that I've come across that used Buzz Hollings' kind of framework was a book called The Upside of Down by Thomas Homer Dixon, in which he's a Canadian political scientist, and basically he coined a term which was catagenesis, which is a coming together of catastrophe and genesis, or birth. So basically he's taking that approach and saying all systems go through a period of breakdown, which is the precondition for renewal. And if you try to stop the breakdown, you make it worse, and you postpone the renewal, or even block it from happening at all. And just to throw in one other thing that's related to this is, have any of you heard of the Bradley method of bush regeneration? It's I think it's a lovely metaphor. There was a pair of sisters in Mosman in Sydney who were involved in bush regeneration on bushy areas around the harbour near Mosman. And after years of trying to eradicate lantana and various other invasive weeds, and feeling like they were getting nowhere because they just couldn't do it fast enough to stop the growth, they changed their approach. And instead of trying to attack the worst outbreaks, they put their effort into strengthening the healthiest parts of that ecosystem. And the ecosystem itself then self-corrected, because the healthiest part of the natural ecosystem competed more successfully with the invasive weeds and over time pushed them back. Floria.
So someone says, I don't know, or they say, the opposite of every great truth is also true. And I'm just thinking about this, thinking about some of what you touched on, Margaret, about who's at the table and why might they not be there? Where are they? I'm bringing this back to the struggle with Lantana. Just thinking how things sometimes we think we're getting there and then we're going backwards, such as where women find themselves in their lives. So we've seen COVID actually taking things backwards, where women are now struggling doing again, like, well, you know, they had been doing the bulk of the housework and so on, but this is actually, it's been pushed even further. So we're seeing women, you know, they've given up their jobs, they've given up their university positions, and they are looking after the children and running the households. I question, you know, where are the people who were not here? You know, we are perhaps, well, for various reasons, we are able to be in this kind of a discussion at 4:30, and you know, there are others out there who are juggling 3 jobs, and you know, they couldn't imagine being able to fit something like this in. So I'm just thinking about Lantana and how, and also COVID being a potential portal, as Arundhati Roy put it, and I think that's been, you know, beautiful thing that she said that was pretty broadly circulated. That struggle, what happens then? What are the strongest plants in the forest, and how do we assess strength? And if we give them more resources, where does that leave the potential for change? Where does that leave some of those other areas where you've had this continued struggle? There's something there that I'm just struggling with.
All this talk about how humans keep doing the same thing, going, you know, the rise in inequality and the war, and then it goes back in another cycle and things, sort of also, I mean, the way we've been talking, it sort of ignores on one level the fact that it's not all about us, and made me think very much of a line that Tyson said in the last discussion that really sort of resonated for me, which was that the land, you know, has a voice and it uses it, and, you know, the land is shaking like a dog getting rid of fleas. And there's a sort of almost a relief in thinking there's something bigger than us that's going to actually sort it out. The only thing is that we don't know quite how bad it's going to be, but there's something about that sense that we can't keep on just making the same mistakes again and again and again, you know. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not wishing things upon us, but I think they're going to happen anyway to some extent, and let's hope we really learn somehow to listen more to you know. And I think this ties in with the Lantana thing as well somehow, but I haven't worked that bit out yet. But, you know, it's anyway. Yeah.
thought is that maybe it's through, I don't know, our education system or our cultural or religious upbringing or whatever it is, that we can control everything, and that we should, to maximize our well-being. And maybe that is the check and balance that's coming our way for that thinking.
Yes, this is what many people writing and talking about the Anthropocene are talking about, that, you know, what's called the Anthropocene paradox, that humans have created this earth-shaping moment, but we don't control it. This is why people like David Abram have said, oh, we shouldn't use this word Anthropocene, because it kind of implies that the anthropos, humans, are the ones that are controlling it all. We should use the term Humilocene, because the most important thing we need to do is to find our humility.
Yeah, I kind of posed a question to others and myself, really, in my last comment. I just had this moment of like, where I was discussing the Lantana and your focus on supporting what's strong already. And I was questioning that. And I think the answer is in the questioning itself, the actual question being, what is strength? How can we differently appreciate strength? If we have these pre-existing notions of what strength is, where strength lies, that's a cultural thing. And, you know, if we open that up to different cultural interpretation, for instance, we could look at patriarchy as a powerful thing. We could say, let's support patriarchy because, you know, we've seen the strength in patriarchy. Or we could look to other things with an entirely different interpretation of what strength actually is, not just where it's coming from, but what does strength mean? And I think, you know, part of that would again consist of slowing down and a heap of very deep self-reflection, deep cultural reflection, just to steer away from these linear paths of thinking.
Strength was probably not the right word, Floria. I think the word was and should be actually health. And it kind of brings us back to the notion of planetary health and our place in that bigger system. So what's the healthiest part of the system, and how do we support its healthy growth and development?
It reminds me quite a lot of the principles behind appreciative inquiry, where you're trying to get more of what you want to see and less of what you don't want to see. And that's not necessarily about strength, but it's about what's working or what's good. And then that is a value judgment, but it always is. So
it's about, I think it's sort of come a few times, it's about relativism. You know, and I came across an article this week about chimpanzees and mothering. And it was talking about, you know, our scientific research into, you know, how chimpanzees mothered their children. and basically the researcher spent a lot of time just hanging out with these chimps and finding that actually we were looking at their mothering technique through, you know, a Western perception of mothering. And, you know, there are many cultures of mothering around the world that aren't all just, you know, cooing and talking directly. You know, I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with that, but just, this idea of relativism in inquiry, I guess. And so I think that's come up for me a few times tonight. And I guess this is part of Nora's work as well, looking at, you know, the context is in the room, in the group. is that there's different perceptions from every angle.
Mhm.
And just to be appreciative of that.
Okay, so please, if you want to share any of your thoughts, you'd be very welcome to do that on the hub. Margaret has become a regular and valuable contributor, always posing some very tricky questions.
Yeah, sorry. Part of me, it's my therapy as well, because I'm like, what the heck are we doing? So I apologize if it comes a bit too, the world's going to end, or like this is effed or something.
It's good to bring our questions and our fears and our dreams into a shared space like that. If any of you feel moved to write something up from today's discussion, you'd be very welcome to do so. So thank you all, and take care until we meet again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That's great.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thanks. Good luck with your submission, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. I'll get back to it now.
Bye.